everyone. Thanks for visiting us at the 2020 Homeschooling Global Summit. We have a very special guest today. We have Kerry McDonald, who is a Senior Education Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education and author of the book Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. She's also an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute and a regular Forbes magazine contributor. Kerry's research interests include homeschooling and alternatives to school, self-directed learning, education entrepreneurship, parent empowerment, school choice, and family and child policy. Her articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, NPR, Education Next, Reason Magazine, and many others. She has a master's degree in education policy from Harvard University and a bachelor's in economics from Bowdoin College. Kerry lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts with her husband and 4 children. Welcome, Kerry. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Liz. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I wanted to first find out how you got involved with homeschooling and alternative education. Can you tell us your story? Because I'm kind of guessing you did not, you were not homeschooled as a child.
No, that's right. I went to K-12 public schools in the suburbs of Boston, and never knew a homeschooler, never knew anything about homeschooling. It wasn't until I went to college and I was an economics major, but became increasingly interested in education, in particular, the fact that there were very few choices for families given sort of this monopoly system of mass schooling. And that led me to take a lot more education classes, and I had a chance to do an independent research project as a senior where I was able to shadow a homeschooling family that lived nearby. And this was in the late 1990s. Homeschooling had just become legally recognized in all US states a few years prior. By the mid-1990s, there were about 850,000 homeschoolers in 1999, which was the first year the US Department of Education began tracking homeschoolers. So it was still a relatively new phenomenon, certainly not the more mainstream option that it has become. But I remember walking into this homeschooling family's home when I was to shadow them for that semester and being completely captivated by what I saw, just this authentic learning tied to the child's interests, real immersion in the community, in the people, places, and things of their neighborhood, and really a sense of education outside of schooling that I had never thought possible because, of course, I had only gone through this conventional system. And it was particularly striking because at that same time, I was doing a student teaching practicum at a local public elementary school, and really saw in real time this contrast between the homeschooling environment, very nurturing, very child-centered, very self-directed, and what was a very conventional kind of command and control type of public school classroom. Again, that I had gone through and never saw anything wrong with it until I really began to imagine other ways of being educated. And so that was what ultimately triggered my interest in education. I went to graduate school in education policy, became much more involved in education choice, the growing charter school movement at the time that was coming on the scene in the early 2000s. But it was about a decade later when I was looking at education choices for my own children that I sort of revisited homeschooling, this time as a mom, and realized that it would really be the best fit for our family. That, you know, we live in Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts, where there's a vibrant and diverse homeschooling community here, and all kinds of libraries, museums, organizations that really cater to providing programming for homeschoolers. So I really felt that if, my husband and I both felt that if we sent our kids to school, their learning would contract. They would be in this, you know, age-segregated classroom with the same static handful of teachers and the same standardized curriculum. Whereas we wanted them to be fully exposed to all of the learning possibilities in our larger community and classes and mentors and just the wide experiences of the real world. So that was how we ultimately, you know, got into homeschooling, and then of course, you know, continued my overall policy work, not only with education choice, but also with homeschooling as well.
Well, I love it. I love talking to people who study homeschooling and education and actually practice that in their own home too. How old are your kids now?
Yeah, they are 13, 11, 9, and 6.
Okay, so still kind of like in the middle of it.
That's right. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yep.
Well, so our summit topic today is related to schools, the public school system, which you left during and after the COVID situation. A lot of families are transitioning from learning in that traditional way to distance learning. You know, I don't really like to call it homeschooling, as I think you as well think that that's not homeschooling, it's crisis schooling or COVID schooling.
Right.
And a lot of them are looking at other methods. So how do you think schools are handling the COVID situation?
Well, it's really interesting. Even early on with the pandemic, when schools were shut down, over 50 million US students, a billion students around the world not in school this spring due to COVID-19. I was surprised, and pleasantly so, of a survey that came out, kind of a few weeks into the shutdown here in the US. That found that it was done by EdChoice, and it found that more than half of the parents surveyed had a more favorable view of homeschooling during the pandemic than previously. And I thought, gee, if you think this is a positive experience when we're all facing such massive disruption and we're all severed from our larger community, just imagine the real thing. Imagine how much better it would be, and what your impression would be if you really were able to connect with those people and places in your community. So I thought that was really interesting that even early on, homeschooling was becoming more intriguing to people, even during the pandemic. And then a more recent survey by USA Today, a poll by USA Today and Ipsos just came out, finding that 60% of parents plan to continue learning at home this fall, even if schools reopen. So I think there's a couple of things going on there. One is perhaps things aren't so bad, that they're actually finding that learning at home with their kids is perhaps more fulfilling than they thought. Maybe it's families who had been considering homeschooling but kind of lacked that catalyst to give it a try, and this has been positive for them. Maybe their kids are calmer or happier, not being bullied. Maybe they're actually enjoying remote learning. And so I think some of it's that. I think, though, probably a larger explanation for just these massive numbers of parents who say that they won't send their children back to school in the fall is because of lingering virus fears. Not only fears of their children contracting the virus, or perhaps vulnerable family members contracting the virus, but also these social distancing requirements that are likely to be in place whenever schools reopen. And so the CDC came out several weeks ago with recommendations for reopening schools and what that would look like, as well as parents seeing images from around the world of schools reopening in many European and Asian countries and saying, gee, I really don't know that I want my kid going to school where they're 6 feet apart from everybody, and they have to wear face masks or face shields all day, and the gym is closed and the playground's closed, and they have to eat lunch at their desk because the cafeteria is closed. All of the things that we might think of as sort of the positive accessories of schooling, the socialization, if you will, right, are really going to be minimized. And so parents might be thinking, gee, and if it's not for that, if it's just about a delivery mechanism for education, maybe we'll stick with virtual learning. So I think we're going to see more parents kind of going that route, at least in the short term.
Yeah, and some schools are talking about 2 days on, 2 days off, or alternate days. And how is that going to work with the family schedule, especially if the parents have to eventually go back to work?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, we're seeing other countries do this as well. The talk here in the US, of course, districts will handle it differently, but this idea that you would go, maybe you'd be in kind of a cohort, and 1 week your cohort might go Monday, Wednesday, and Friday and do virtual learning Tuesday and Thursday, and then the following week you would swap. Which leads to a lot of disruption in family lives. And I think, of course, too, a lot of adults don't know what their work situation is going to be like in the fall. So there's just so much uncertainty around that. I think that there's also, the Brookings Institution, for example, came out with a study finding that they expect teleworking, parents working from home remotely, to continue even after the pandemic ends, that this is going to open up a whole new comfort level with remote workers. And that might also create some more flexibility for families to say, gee, there's a whole host of other ways we could be approaching education than just that 5-day-a-week schedule at the local school.
Yeah, as they should, because, you know, I've been a digital nomad remote worker for 4+ years. It's the best way to live. I don't have to drive an hour each way to an office to work on a computer that I could do at home and miss my kids. So I personally am glad that this is happening. I'm glad that the world is getting up with the times. So it seems like a lot of these stereotypes that people had about homeschoolings are being broken, but there's still some naysayers out there. You've recently been pretty high profile in a showdown with Harvard professor Elizabeth Bartholet. I watched the fascinating panel discussion that recently was held on the Cato Institute's website. So can you tell us briefly what happened with that panel discussion and what the big fuss is about for those Americans, those people not living in America, because we have a global audience and not in the know of what's happening?
Right. So in the May-June issue of Harvard Magazine, which is the alumni magazine for Harvard University, there was an article that came out called "The Risks of Homeschooling" that sent the homeschooling community, many members of the homeschooling community, you know, in an uproar over this kind of one-sided, disingenuous attack on homeschooling. And it was related to an 80-page Arizona Law Review article that Harvard Law School professor Elizabeth Bartholet had written, calling for a presumptive ban on homeschooling that would allow, under her kind of regulatory regime, would allow the government to permit parents to homeschool only if they first met certain conditions, like they had to prove that they were worthy of the task, they had to agree to annual standardized testing by school district officials, they had to still agree to send their children to the local public school for at least some classes during the day, and they would have to agree to frequent home visits by government officials to make sure there was no wrongdoing. So understandably, many homeschoolers were upset and angry at this proposal. And there were many articles written, many letters to the editor of Harvard Magazine, many news media that covered this story. And it was great that my colleague at the Cato Institute, Neil McCluskey, who runs the Center for Educational Freedom there, reached out to Professor Bartholet, as well as Professor Milton Gaither, who's a historian who studies homeschooling at Messiah College. And the four of us were able to participate in this 90-minute lively online webinar that you can still find now at the Cato website. So, you know, it was great to kind of flesh out some of these issues to provide, I thought, to be able to provide a more robust picture of what 21st century homeschooling is really like. You know, what do homeschoolers in 2020 look like, that I think is very, very different from the picture that she painted in the Law Review piece.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, I think everyone should watch it because it was a wonderful panel discussion. Okay, so now that a lot of these stereotypes are being broken, more people are open to homeschooling and other alternative methods. What do you recommend? What models do you think are going to become popular after the COVID situation? Whether it's, I think, homeschooling, or you have some other ideas for in-person schools, or also distance learning, correct?
Right. I think there'll be some short-term changes in education as well as some long-term changes. I think in the short term, we already talked a little bit about what schools themselves might look like. I think at the district level, schools will probably try to be more flexible. You know, it's in their best interest to not lose families to homeschooling or some other private options, right? So I think that they'll probably try to be more flexible, understanding parents' reservations about sending kids to school, and maybe relax some of the compulsory attendance laws as a result of that. And we've seen that in previous epidemics. For example, in the 1916 polio epidemic in New York City, when schools reopened in New York City, a quarter of the parents didn't send their kids back to school. And so the district, rather than enforcing, you know, mandatory attendance, just loosened, relaxed their compulsory attendance laws for the short term. So I think we'll see some of that, because I think, again, districts themselves will want to be flexible. But outside of the public system, yeah, I think, parents are being very innovative. I've even talked to parents locally who say, when their child's preschool or grade school reopens, they're not going to send them back, mainly because they're not happy with these social distancing requirements. They don't like the idea that their 3-year-old, for example, is not going to have any interaction with any of the other 3-year-olds.
So hard to do at that age.
It's true. And so what they're doing, it's really creative, is banding together with other, friends and acquaintances, or maybe other parents who had gone to that preschool, and getting to small groups of, 4 or 5 families who will take turns really in kind of running a co-op, or, we'll take the kids one day while you all work, and then the next day another family will take them. And I'm seeing this also with older kids as well. I think, again, parents seeing that, virtual learning seems to be working out, and my kid's happy and thriving, and we're still working from home. We might as well just get together with small groups of families and see if we can make something creative work. So I think we'll see that. I think we will see a booming interest in outdoor schools, in the forest preschool, forest kindergarten phenomenon that was already gaining steam. But we'll likely see more of that, because it's easier to sort of manage social distancing and perhaps minimize virus concerns with these outside learning environments. So I think that will continue to grow. Certainly, online learning programs will flourish during this time. Online degree programs, or other kinds of supplemental programs for people, for kids being at home who may want something different than the district school's offering, or something supplemental to that. And then finally, yeah, I think homeschooling. I think we'll see more families decide to commit to homeschooling in the long term. I mean, even when things get back to normal and the pandemic ends, I would be surprised if we don't ultimately see an uptick in the number of families choosing homeschooling for the long term.
Mm-hmm. I've actually been doing a little bit of a research study, just casually, to find out the countries around the world where homeschooling is legal, pre-pandemic, and looking at the numbers. And the US, in the past, the numbers were 3 million. What do you think it's going to get up to over the next several years?
I don't know that I could put a number on it. I would say, in the US right now, homeschoolers are around 2 million, which is about 3.5% of the overall K-12 population. I don't think it would be unheard of to say that we could get to 5%, within the next couple of years.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. You also mentioned microschools in that article that you wrote about the various recommendations that you have. But microschools are still indoors mostly, and they're in close quarters. So how would they be able to manage a post-COVID world?
Yeah, I spotlighted in I think the Forbes article that you're talking about, the Prenda School network, which is in Arizona, fast-growing network of microschools. That is also expanding beyond the state. And they work on this in-home kind of microschool model, that's sort of hybrid homeschooling. A lot of the families access it through a virtual charter school program in Arizona, so it's tuition free. And I think that it's almost like what I was mentioning before, that I'm seeing neighbors near me thinking about doing. It's this idea that you could manage social distancing, or manage kind of mitigating virus concerns if you have a small group of families banding together in a home to make learning work. And I think that that's what we'll see with these microschools. I think in the long term, though, there will be more of this interest in these hybrid homeschooling models as parents get a taste of the freedom and flexibility of this learning approach.
Mm-hmm. All right, we know that not all families can homeschool. Some of the parents they're essential workers, or eventually they'll have to go to an office or a factory or warehouse or a hospital to work. So, or perhaps some people just can't afford the tuition fees that these alternative, either brick and mortar or online centers have. So what do you recommend to those parents in that position? They're kind of stuck with the public system. What do you think that they should do to kind of push the current traditional school system to be more like the types of education that you're recommending?
Right. So there's a couple of things. First is I would say that close to 1/3 of the homeschooling families in the US have two parents who work outside of the home. So the idea that you have, or the stereotype that you have, a stay-at-home parent who's kind of managing homeschooling around the kitchen table is just really not true anymore. And part of that is because, like I mentioned, we have these hybrid homeschool models, self-directed learning centers, co-op programs, resource centers for homeschoolers, virtual learning programs that really make homeschooling more accessible to more families. And in the case of many of these self-directed learning centers, for example, they operate at a fraction of the cost of other available private options, anywhere from 1/3 to 1/4 of the cost of a typical private school. So it makes it more accessible to more families for whom financial issues would be a problem. And I think, again, you have these co-op models where families can kind of band together in very low-cost ways to make homeschooling work. And then, like I mentioned, you have these networks of microschools or hybrid programs that operate many times under public charter school laws. So I mentioned Prenda in Arizona. In California, they're public charter schools, virtual public charter schools that really act as an umbrella system for homeschoolers, allowing parents to access this model tuition free, and they still get curriculum guidelines and teacher interaction, able to really work with their kids in the ways that they choose. Some of these are completely virtual, but there's others like the Da Vinci Network in the Los Angeles area that is a 2-day-a-week program on site, project-based learning for these charter school homeschoolers. And then the remaining 3 days are at home or out in the community elsewhere, again, making this model so much more accessible to more families.
Excellent. Okay, so if you had the ear of the leaders in education, in the Department of Education in the US or the ministries of education around the world, if you could wave a magic wand, what would you advise them if they were willing to listen?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key really is to decentralize power in education and put education back in the control of families, so that it's parents making the decisions that are best for their children, which would involve expanding education choice mechanisms. So encouraging, passing legislation that focuses on education savings accounts or voucher programs, lifting caps on charter schools, encouraging tax credit scholarship programs, anything that enables parents to be put back in charge of their child's education and gives them many more choices beyond an assigned district school.
Excellent, great. Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about projects that you're working on currently?
Right, well, so I'm a senior education fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education. That's where I spend a lot of my time interacting with parents and focused on, spreading the ideas of individual freedom and limited government, prosperity through free markets and peace. So that's where most of my work is. I'll be speaking at Freedom Fest in Las Vegas in July, which brings together a lot of folks who, care about these issues and ideas. And yeah, just continuing to write as much as possible on not only kind of current education trends and future trends, but also expanding education freedom to more families.
Excellent. Can you tell us a little bit about the book that you wrote, Unschooled?
Right. So I wrote the book Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. It was published last spring by Chicago Review Press, but has actually been had peaking interest this spring as a result of the pandemic, with, of course, so many families learning at home suddenly with their children. There were a few reasons that I wanted to write the book. One was to spotlight all of the wide variety of ways that individuals, families, organizations approach self-directed education, focus on learning without schooling, really spotlight alumni experiences of young people who grew up this way to see what that was like. I also wanted to show that homeschooling, or unschooling in particular, didn't just begin in the 1970s with John Holt. Of course, as many of your viewers will know, one of the pioneers of the modern homeschooling movement in the US, an author and social reformer, who coined the term unschooling in 1977 that he defined as taking children out of school. And of course, it's kind of evolved in its definition over time to mean self-directed learning. But really, there's a much longer, richer history prior to John Holt that kind of led up to what we would consider the modern unschooling movement. So I wanted to highlight that. And then I also really wanted to provide space to share the stories of these phenomenal entrepreneurial educators, many of whom, the vast majority of whom in the book, were conventional public school teachers who became so disillusioned by what they were seeing in the classroom that they left to create these innovative education models, like these self-directed learning centers for homeschoolers, like democratic free schools that are modeled after the Sudbury model, or other kinds of innovative programs, world schooling programs, teen apprenticeship programs, camp programs for homeschoolers. It was just fascinating to see their stories and to be able to share those.
Wonderful. I haven't read it yet, but I will soon, because I'm obviously a fan of self-directed learning. We do have a whole day in the summit dedicated to unschooling. So I encourage anyone listening to what Kerry has to say who's fascinated to learn a little bit more about it, because I do find that a lot of families who are leaving the public or private school system, they initially will purchase a box curriculum or do kind of an online program that is, you know, the public school system online. But eventually the kids start revolting a little, and they find themselves months or years later into the self-directed learning camp. And so I encourage people, instead of waiting those years or months, those painful times when you're trying to force your kids to learn things that you think that they should learn, look into self-directed learning, like Kerry mentioned. So, and yeah, a couple of things. I was wondering some predictions that you have for the future of education. I mean, you've already kind of talked about what you would advise the ministries of education, but what do you think is going to come like 5, 10, 20 years from now?
Well, I think now that parents have a glimpse of what it means to be put back in charge of their child's education, even if they're still at arm's length with the district doing a, kind of school at home curriculum, they're still seeing more what happens in the classroom. Maybe they feel slightly more confident about their ability to facilitate their child's education. And then just the larger point of seeing different modes of education, just education beyond the four walls of a conventional school classroom. I think that's going to stay. And once parents have now had the taste of education choice, they're going to demand more of it. So I would definitely expect that we'll see more calls for education choice beyond a mandatory school assignment. I think that certainly we're going to see virtual schooling grow. I think that there'll be, many more opportunities for education entrepreneurship and innovation. And I think that this could be, a really transformative moment. I often talk about the work of Terry Moe at Stanford University, who wrote a book last year called The Politics of Institutional Reform, where he describes what happened in 2005 in the wake of Hurricane Katrina that devastated the city of New Orleans, and really reworked the entire public school system there to make it an almost all charter school system. And he argues that that could not have happened had it not been for the level of disruption brought on by the hurricane that really weakened and in some cases eliminated these long-held power structures and bureaucratic systems of control. And it was because of that disruption that allowed for these new agile, flexible learning models to come on the scene. And so I think we'll see the same type of change, of experimentation, and of maybe embracing new models of K-12 learning as a result of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I know, Kerry, most of your research is done on homeschooling families or the education system in the United States. We have a global audience, and I admin the Facebook group for the summit, the Homeschooling Global Society, and I am talking regularly to homeschooling families or people who want to from all around the world. They live in countries where homeschooling is illegal, like Germany, where they will be sent to jail and their children taken away from them, or they're living in a country where it's the gray area. And then now that the pandemic is hitting them too. So I think this is a shockwave around the world. I'm just wondering, you know, I kind of look at the US homeschooling system as not a model, but at least a beacon of hope for other countries around the world. I'm friends with the homeschooling advocate in Taiwan, Tim Chen, and he's done a lot of great things to pass laws in their countries to make homeschooling legal and free. And I'm really hoping the domino effect, they'll all fall down. So what hope do you have for other parents in other countries? What advice do you have for them to advocate for their governments to change the laws?
Well, I hope that the US remains a beacon for education freedom, in particular homeschooling for families around the world. That was part of the heart of the debate with the Harvard professor who in her law review article looks to many of these European countries. In particular, she cites Germany as the model for the US to follow, with either outright bans on homeschooling as Germany has, or heavily regulated, intrusive homeschooling regulations that make homeschooling very, very difficult for many families. So, you know, I think the fight continues, right, to continue to secure homeschooling freedoms, to continue to fight for the right of parents to raise and educate their children as they choose. And I think that parents around the world, you know, are very much a part of that fight and that process, and hopefully can, especially now with the pandemic disrupting education, can really push for some changes that make homeschooling easier and more accessible to more people.
Excellent. Thank you, Kerry. You have been a wealth of wisdom and advice. I really appreciate you joining us and sharing with with our audience your amazing thoughts. Now, what is the best way for people to get a hold of you? Are you active on Twitter, or is there an email they can contact?
The best way to reach me is to visit my website at fee.org, so fee.org/Kerry, K-E-R-R-Y. And there you'll see all of my articles, you'll see a link to my book, and you'll see all my social media accounts to connect with me there, as well as go ahead and send me an email.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kerry McDonald. Great to see you today.
Great to be with you, Liz. Thanks.